Good afternoon, folks, or good morning for those of you that are on the west side of the country. We will begin in just a moment. Just before we get into the slides, I'll introduce myself. My name is Matt Richardson. I'm the FAA's NextGen PM project manager for the Remote Tower Pilot Program. And I'll be walking you through the slides we have today. Just a quick note of point, if at any point you have any questions that you would like answered throughout this briefing, there is a Q&A functionality that's available. There should be a button on your Zoom taskbar, which will take you to the Q&A screen. So feel free to submit questions at any point during the conversation. I'll try and keep it open as we have our discussions here, and then I can answer things live as they come in. But worst case, I should have some reserved time at the end here, and I can go through the remaining questions and do a little bit of a Q&A session. So hopefully we can get them all answered, depending on the amount or volume of questions. And if not, then if we don't have time in this hour, I will certainly take the action to get answers out to the ones we don't address. That being said, we're going to jump right into the slides here. So we should be ready to go. So folks, today I'm going to take you through a little bit of background about the Remote Tower Pilot Program, where the Remote Tower Pilot Program really started based on the Congressional direction, what the Remote Tower Pilot Program Strategy has been up until recently, and then what it will be going forward. And then the system design approval and commissioning process we have established as part of that pilot program, and also the timeline associated with those. And really what my focus will be throughout all these topics is how that really impacts the airports that are looking to get remote towers. So we'll really focus in on that in these slides. Then we'll talk about the siting process that is being developed for remote towers and the business case for both FCTs, and then just the generic concept of what business case faults that airports might need to contemplate when considering a remote tower over a brick and mortar. So like I said, the Remote Tower Pilot Program is a congressionally directed pilot program. It was established in the 2018 Reauthorization Act for the FAA. The Reauthorization Act actually directed the FAA to establish a Remote Tower Pilot Program to achieve three main goals. The first of which was to evaluate the technical and operational feasibility of applying remote tower technology in the NAS. The second is to establish minimum standards and a clear process for operational certification of remote towers. And then the third is to understand the business case of establishing and operating remote towers in the NAS. So I think we're well underway with all three of these activities, and we'll get more in detail on how we're achieving these activities as we go forward. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. As far as the Remote Tower Pilot Program Strategy, we started back in actually 2016-ish timeframe, 2015, 2016 timeframe, before the Remote Tower Pilot Program was established by the FAA reauthorization in a test site based strategy where we were actually implementing a remote tower at specific test sites. Our first one was in Leesburg, Virginia. Our second was in Fort Collins, Colorado. And these test sites were really to establish whether a vendor's system could come and be used in an operational setting to control traffic in Class D airports. And as we progressed down this strategy, we realized that this approach was rather limiting in that the system that was being certified as is, and also only to the constraints of the site that it was installed at. So for instance, if we were installed at a single runway, 7,000-foot runway, then the system would only be certified at that level, and that was restrictive of then the vendors being able to go on and sell and implement beyond that. To address these issues, we came up with a new strategy, which we released in September of 2022, where we will no longer be selecting individual pilot sites at various airports, and instead we've established a centralized test bed for certifying remote towers, which is actually located it's at the Atlantic City Airport in New Jersey. But the test bed itself is just off of the airport premises in the National Aerospace Research and Technology Park, which is just outside of the Atlantic City Airport. To get a system into this test bed, vendors have been asked to pass pass the FAA intake review process, which is an established process, requires a series of documentation that supports that the vendor system is mature enough and ready to come to FAA testing. And that is really a precursor to what we'll talk more about as I get further into these slides, which is the full system design approval process, or the full certification of those remote tower systems. And we think taking this approach really accelerates the timeline in meeting the goals of the congressional direction that was provided in 2018. We think it provides a more robust evaluation of vendor systems and allows the FAA to explore more environmental and operational balance for the remote tower system. So what I mean by that is now we have a more flexible test bed where we can test different runway lengths, for instance, different runway configurations. We have a lot more adaptability in the way we test at Atlantic City than we would at the individual pilot sites. And that'll provide a broader solution then to the remote tower marketplace. And finally, it does reduce, this approach really is intended to reduce risk to both the FAA and the airport sponsors that are looking to bring in remote towers. And in the case that a vendor system cannot meet FAA standards, which we were hoping to avoid through this test bed approach with the intake process, but in the case at least that we're containing that into a test bed environment, and we're not actually trying to implement these systems out in the NAS before they've been certified. Here we have just some pictures and some status updates of this test bed as it's being developed out. So on the right is the airfield of the ACY. Like I said, we have a little bit more flexibility with this airspace and what we want to do. We have the nice long 10,000-foot runway, so it gives us more flexibility in how we test and what we can test to. We did actually start the fit out of the ACY facility, and it is due to be complete. The internal fit out of the facility is due to be complete in October. The airfield site infrastructure that we're building to support the remote tower NAS and power and comms and things like that is scheduled to be complete in February of 24. And in spring of 24, we anticipate our first system being installed and begin to go through the certification process. So here's really the meat and potatoes of the process that we are looking to go through with each of our vendors at ACY. So I should state right now, there's two parts to really how a remote tower goes from being a vendor concept to being installed and operational in an airport. The first part is what we're doing at ACY, which is the system design approval. That is the actual paperwork, documentation, testing, all the check marks we have to meet from the FAA side to prove that the systems meet the requirements that have been set out by the FAA. The second part is actually a commissioning process. This process should be much shorter. The process is under development right now, but we're thinking tentatively about a 90-day process. And that's really just linked into the equipment commissioning that you would do for other NASA equipment. It's going to be a similar sort of process with maybe a few key changes that there might be some operational things that we need to look at based on airport environments. But it should look fairly similar. So just to take you through what these two processes involve, to give everyone an understanding, I already mentioned from a system design approval that each vendor has to start with a system intake. That's really just the initial paperwork and documentation to show that the vendor has a mature system. And once they've gotten through that system intake gate, then they will be allowed to install their system at the Atlantic City Test Bed. From the Atlantic City Test Bed, they go down two paths. They have a documentation review, which is the technical side and making sure that the system meets the technical requirements, as well as a functional air traffic acceptance evaluation, which is more where we actually run the system through operational scenarios. We hire test controllers and test pilots to go run operational scenarios in ACY airport environment. And both of those two processes then come together for the vendor to then achieve their system design approval. So it takes two parts. It takes the operational and the technical validation for a vendor to achieve system design approval. Now, at this point, at this point, once the vendor's achieved system design approval, that's the first time where the FAA would allow the discussion about the vendor bringing a system into the NAS and actually installing and getting commissioned at an airport to use operationally. So just to reiterate that, systems need to go through system design approval before they can be used operationally in the NAS. That takes you into the commissioning process. So once you've got a system design approval, then you can go commission at an airport. And that's pretty high level process. Like I said, it should be pretty quick. It's similar to what you might do for an MEL perspective. An airport or sponsor would select a system from the qualified vendor system list. So that would be the list of all the vendors that have the system design approval. Different vendors may have systems that are more applicable to different airport environments or different runway configurations. So they'll hopefully sometime in the future there will be multiple vendors that have gotten through this process, and then airports can have an option on which vendors they might want to choose depending on their specific scenarios. And then per the usual process of bringing a tower into airport, you coordinate with your implementation manager. You do your camera sighting or your tower sighting process, and we'll talk on a future slide about how that might be a little bit different for cameras. And then you go through your system install and optimization, which would be a kind of a vendor-led activity. And then where the process is differing a little bit is we do have likely a small amount of air traffic operational viability evaluation. So there might be a few scenarios that we might need to go through from an operational perspective at site. But like I said, we're trying to keep that pretty short, pretty low key. And once you've completed that part of the commissioning process, you would get a operational viability decision memo or a memo from air traffic that says that this system is ready to be commissioned. And that would directly lead into commissioning and the tower starting operations like they would with a regular brick and mortar tower. This is just a high level timeline of what we anticipate a vendor going through the SDA process would take. It is important to note, and I mentioned this already in a previous slide, we already have one vendor that's made significant headway into this process. So we do have one vendor that has completed the intake process, which is the first step, and is underway with the documentation review process and audits, and plans to install at our test bed in the early 2024 timeframe. The process itself, from installation through to when we complete our work at the test bed, takes about 24 months. So that each vendor will anticipate having their system at the test bed for about 24 months. And the whole process from the day that a vendor comes to the FAA asking for certification to when we anticipate they're going to get that certification is anticipated to be just about shy of 3 years. So that's the whole process from day one to when a vendor could take a system to an airport and start the commissioning. It is important to note as well that an important part of this process is going through safety risk management panels and documentation. So that is an established process within the FAA. We are following that established process with this program. So we are utilizing current safety controls and safety hazard assessment processes to analyze these systems to make sure that they are safe and do what they intend for operational use. I mentioned that sighting may be a little bit different for remote towers. So there are some natural differences between sighting of a human eyeball, as in a tower cab with windows and human eyeballs, versus sighting a camera. We have been working to draft a new remote tower specific sighting order, which would be published alongside the current FAA sighting order, the JO 6480.4, as well as a new VISTA process for remote towers, which is underway. The one thing we do have published already is the visibility analysis tool, which the FAA has available for free for any airports on the web. Now has a second optional functionality, which allows you to do a visibility analysis for remote towers for camera-based solutions. Now, I will say when you go down that route, it would be important to have a vendor in the loop on that, because when you're talking about cameras, you start getting into a lot of technical configuration specs and specs of specific vendor cameras that need to be input into the tool to give reliable data. So you will need vendors input, at least to perform a visibility analysis for a remote tower. We also have the remote tower preliminary hazard list for sighting, and subsequent work is underway currently to determine acceptable 3D modeling to simulate camera views for sighting panels. So I know 3D modeling is a big part of current sighting processes with brick and mortar towers. So we are leveraging that to understand how that might be different for remote towers, or how we might have to adjust the process for remote towers. Okay, so now we get into more of the cost benefit side of the house. Since the FCT program, or the FAA Contract Tower program, relies mostly on a cost benefit model to accept airports into the FCT program, we have had to look at and what implications remote towers have towards that cost benefit program. So this slide is specifically on the FAA's cost benefit program for FCTs, and then the next slide will get more into airport specific cost benefits that might be consideration. One thing to note is the FAA's cost benefit model does only take into account FAA incurred costs. So it does not talk about, when we're talking about sponsored on FCTs, is not talk about construction of brick and mortar towers or anything like that. So when we are looking at the costs associated with remote towers versus brick and mortar towers, there is very minimal cost differences between the two from an FAA perspective. So it doesn't really impact the cost part of the cost benefit model all that much. We have a very minimal increased cost with an annual tech ops inspection for an increased system or hardware and software system that you have inside your tower. But other than that, it's very minimal. Where there is a little bit more of a gray area is where the benefits come into play. So just because this remote tower concept is new to or relatively new to aviation in general across the globe, there's not a whole lot of safety benefit data out there to be collected from remote towers that are in operation, especially not in the US, since we've only had one here in operation in Leesburg, Virginia for a short period of time. So instead of utilizing a significant portion of data, which is what eventually we'd like to get to, the FAA took a risk-based approach and reduced the safety benefits by 10% flat across the board for remote towers until more data is become available. What we're seeing is this really doesn't make too much of an impact on most airports' cost-benefit ratio, and most that were over 1 before, they're still over 1 for a remote tower. But obviously, all airports will have the option to apply for remote tower or brick and mortars once system design approvals have been concluded and are available for remote tower systems to be installed. This slide, we really wanted to just highlight on some of the main cost differences that an airport might want to consider when determining whether they want to pursue a remote tower solution for their airport tower or a brick and mortar. So we just wanted to put these out there. We're not saying that one or the other is more expensive in any which category. We're just more highlighting where changes, where you might see differences or you might see changes. So the first we know is the facility construction. Do you know remote tower vendors that are out there usually are selling these remote towers on that they're cheaper, and that might be the case for facility construction. It might not. It really depends on the construction prices and the size of the tower you're looking at. But there definitely is something to look at in pricing the facility construction, the actually infrastructure construction of a brick and mortar compared to the remote tower system, and what infrastructure that requires. The second one is the actual procurement of the equipment of remote towers. So obviously in a brick and mortar, you don't have to buy any equipment to look out a window. You just need windows and the tower cap. Now, I'm not saying there's not other equipment that goes in our brick and mortar, but we're not really anticipating there to be much differences. You're still going to be required to have your standard minimum equipment list items such as comm equipment, weather equipment, those kind of things that will still be applicable in both a brick and mortar and a remote tower. The sparing is a consideration for remote towers. So if you want to keep spares on site, if you want increased availability of your systems, having spares on site is a good thing for availability, but they'll obviously take space and cost money. So those are kind of things that airports should be talking to vendors about once if they're pursuing a remote tower. And then obviously there's airfield equipment that comes along with remote towers too. So there's infrastructure such as tower masts and where the cameras are located and trenching power and comm. Not that these things aren't also applicable when you're building a brick and mortar, but in a remote tower system, you could potentially have a configuration where you have multiple masts and you need power and comm to come to multiple parts of the airfield. So we wanted to just highlight that here, and that there might be additional costs with a remote tower that you might not see in a brick and mortar. For training, there will be an additional body of training for remote towers for a controller to train on the system itself. It's fairly minimal, so I don't think that that's going to play too much of a factor here, but we at least wanted to highlight it. For building maintenance, you've got kind of slightly two different paths, and depending on which vendors you discuss with, they're going to have different prices and structures on how they do their maintenance. But obviously with a brick and mortar, there's upkeep and maintenance of the physical tower itself. With a remote tower, not only do you have the facility that you need to maintain, but you have the system that needs to be maintained as well. And then finally, utilities. So you have your standard utilities for a brick and mortar tower. Those prices may differ when you're talking about a remote tower. You might save money on some utilities depending on the application. You might also spend more on utilities such as electric. Just really depends on your situation and what vendor you pick and things like that. Yeah, so that's really the brunt of what I had for today. Just to recap, the FAA is no longer selecting individual airport remote tower pilot sites. We will be going to the Atlantic City Test Bed for all evaluation and system design approval for all vendors from now on since 2022. And then to reiterate, we are anticipating that all vendors should obtain a system design approval and be entered into the qualified vendor system list by the end of their time at the ACY test bed. And it will not be until that point that they should be looking to go install systems at airports for commissioning. So we will not, I think I've said this a few times already, but we will not be commissioning any systems in the NAS until the vendor that we are commissioning has been through system design approval. Like I mentioned on a previous slide, the qualified vendor system list will indicate what airport environment that system is suitable for. So at some point, we envision having multiple vendors and even maybe multiple systems from the same vendor that are certified for different airport configurations, and an airport can then go in, look and choose and pick which one is most applicable for their environment. And finally, I should highlight, we're not anticipating our first remote tower system to enter the QVSL and achieve a system design approval until late 2025. So that's the timeline for that vendor that I mentioned was already undergoing evaluation at ACY. Once the qualified vendor system list has been established, then we know there will be a remote tower system commissioning process. The remote tower system commissioning process at a high level is currently outlined in the Remote Tower Advisory Circular, which I have a link on the next slide that will take you to all the documentation available for remote towers, including this briefing, which will be posted on there after we clean up the recording. The commissioning process itself, like I said, is a high level in the advisory circular. You should anticipate seeing some more detailed level commissioning information coming out in the next 6 to 12 months. But I think at a base level, at least, we're still looking for airports to coordinate with their program implementation manager, their PIM, before they go down purchasing a remote tower system or any brick and mortar tower. Also, we're still looking for airports to complete camera sighting for remote towers. So that would be the remote tower camera sighting process. And then we're still looking for we are now additionally looking for airports to do a short operational viability evaluation at each site to conclude commissioning of that system. Okay, so just like I said on the previous slide, this is a great link if you're interested in pursuing more knowledge on remote towers, where the FAA stands with remote towers today, what our requirements look like, and anything just in general, any questions or looking for contact information, that's all listed on this website. The advisory circular is a great place to start. It really is the high-level, top-down overview of the remote tower pilot program and how remote towers are going to be integrated into the NAS and how an airport might anticipate a remote tower could come to their airport in the future. And as well as we develop more documentation to support remote towers, since this is a relatively new concept in the US, at least, those will be uploaded directly to this website too and made publicly available. At this point, we're going to open up for some Q&A, but I did provide my contact information there. If anything comes to your mind in the future and you want to reach out, feel free to reach out to me at that email listed here. So I'm looking over on the Q&A panel. I do not see any questions at this time, so I'll give people a minute if they have any questions to submit. Oh, there's one already coming in. So I'll just read them out. I think everyone can see them, or I assume everyone can see them, but I'll read them out anyway so you know which one I'm addressing. So you mentioned all vendors will have to complete the SDA process prior to commissioning at any airport, and that process takes up to 3 years. Will any vendor's path to commissioning become shorter once the FAA has established the first SDA for an individual vendor? So yes, so that's a good question. So the SDA process itself is really a one-time process per system. So once the vendor has gotten through the SDA process at ACY, then that system is then available to go install and commission at any airport. And we only envision that commissioning to take a few months. So that system will be then available for any airport. Now, if the vendor wanted to come with a second system that was completely new, they would have to go through the SDA process again with that system at ACY. But for the system that they took through the first time, it's a one and done 3 years. It's not at each airport. As we go forward with multiple vendors and we go through the commissioning process, the system design approval process multiple times, we do envision that we'll be able to compress schedules for future vendors as we learn more. But as it is right now, it's already a pretty tight schedule. I would say it's already pretty compressed. We've already learned a lot from our first 2 pilot sites, so I don't envision it being too much shorter than that. The next question I see is what will happen to the remote towers operating in Virginia and Colorado? So that's another good question. So there's 2 different answers for each site. So the vendor in Virginia, in Leesburg, Virginia, actually sent a letter to the FAA saying they were no longer pursuing system design approval back in February of this year. And I believe, well, I don't believe, they've actually backed out and they're pulling their system out of Virginia. And I believe at some point they maybe have indicated a desire to come back to the tech center with a more mature system in the future to get through system design approval then. But as of right now, the Virginia test site has been in the process of closing down, and we anticipate the test site as part of the pilot program will be finished and concluded by the end of September of this year. For Colorado, we're still opening to continuing the system design approval of that system in Fort Collins, Colorado. So we're not going to abandon that site. The vendor is still there and still providing documentation and things towards system design approval. We still have a lot of work to go with Colorado, so I still think there's a long path ahead of us there to get through both the operational side of conducting live testing, as well as the technical side of review and documentation and things like that. But that project isn't going anywhere. We're still going to maintain that there and run that in parallel to the activities at the test bed. Next question is, I understand for a certain vendor, will other vendors have a shorter path than the 3-year Aquinas is partaking now? So I think this is a follow-on to the first question I answered. My answer is potentially there's potential as we learn to shorten timeframes and do the best we can to keep compressing the time frame for certification as best as possible. However, like I said, I think our process at this point is pretty well established. I think we're already running a fairly tight and succinct schedule, and that's where it maps to the 3 years. So I think we can anticipate the 3-year number being somewhere in the realm of where we go from vendor to vendor. I will say, and I say this pretty much every time I brief, so I missed saying it already in this briefing, and I'm glad you bring it up. All of these schedules are dependent on the vendor's ability to produce documentation in a timely manner for that documentation to be complete and meet the requirements that the FAA has set out for them, and also for the system to be mature and to be operational, able to provide controllers the information they need to provide air traffic services. So we are dependent in schedule on the vendor's ability to prove their system. Any more questions? I think that's the last one I have in the Q&A open. Okay, well, like I said, we will make this this briefing and hopefully the recording available online shortly on the website that's linked right here. If you want to take a screenshot, that might be a good idea, just so you have the link. And then you'll be able to go on and find any of our material. So look out for that in the next week or two. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out. I will be happy to help and assist with any questions you might have. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and we'll wrap up now.